Hello, very beautiful community. I have been away for 2 days because my health and my heart symptoms were too volatile to find the moment to post, but I've found the moment to post and speak with you now. So let's get into it and say a couple of words about what on earth is going on in the world. So maybe a word on Syria, a word on South Korea, a word on Georgia, and a word on the endless talk about Trump's supposed peace deal. Syria is in the middle of descending into a civil war slash multi-pronged proxy war. And I've got two questions from you. One's, how bad is this for the Putin regime? And two is, how do you pick the lesser evil between the regime and the rebel groups? This is a medium-level humiliation for Putin. The prospect of the loss of strategic assets in Syria. But there is nothing about this for Putin that no matter what happens in Syria could be regime destabilizing or regime threatening. It could certainly be that for Assad, but it's not that for Putin. So this is not nice and embarrassing, but it's not in any way existential for Putin. In terms of your question of how do you pick, there are two ways to do it. One is that you can pick the lesser evil between the regime and the rebels by asking, from whom do the refugees run away and to whom do they come back? But then you have to ask a second question to which the first question can't be completely equated, and that is, what is the national interest of the country you come from, right? So if you're in the United States, what is the US national interest in this multi-pronged proxy slash civil war? These would be the two criteria. So shall we do South Korea briefly? President Yoon illegally and without evidence of North Korean infiltration of the South Korean opposition, declared martial law. Opposition lawmakers put a motion of impeachment in response. I want to say nothing specific about it because I want to leave this to country experts, but let me as a political philosopher say something about democracy here. What you're seeing in South Korea is kind of a version of normal for democracy, in the sense that democracy and crisis can coexist. What you're seeing in South Korea is the generator kicking in and the electricity going out. It means that something has gone wrong, but it doesn't mean that all systems have failed. It is, in a sense, a case of actually democracy working in response to a crisis. And you could argue working better than some Western democracies might under equivalent circumstances. A word about Georgia. Tragic, but of course less humanly tragic than Syria. Because if you are losing your democracy, you can still go to the restaurant, you can still enjoy, you can still take a holiday. Doesn't threaten the lives of the majority of the citizenry. After a lull, post-election lull, and partly triggered by a statement about the EU by the Prime Minister, very wide-ranging protests have ensued, have been going on for a week now. And my analysis is pessimistic. European influence in the region is minimal. We are in a dynamic of withdrawal. Georgia is up to its neck in trade and economic relations with Russia. The Georgian elite is up to its neck in dependence on trade and economic relations with Russia for power and enrichment. And these protesters are doing something like trying to reach for the other side of the river, which is the west. But the bank of the other side keeps receding further and further from their grasp as they stretch out to reach for it. So the dynamics that we've just briefly mentioned can't easily be challenged just by street politics, by making street politics bigger and then bigger than that and then bigger than that. You don't necessarily get the job done. You need a combination of street politics and very effective strategic inter- and intra-institutional political conflict. So the prognosis is pessimistic, I'm afraid to say. Let's say a word about Trump's so-called deal. There are two features of it that keep being talked about, it seems to me, above all. So let's say a word about each of them. The first feature is that Trump's approach will be to turn the taps on support for Ukraine off, to bring if Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate, and to turn them on even more if the Russians refuse to negotiate. And I don't believe that equation makes sense. Trump, as the president of the United States, certainly will have some leverage over Putin. But at the level of stopping or increasing support for Ukraine, it's not clear that he has leverage. He can plausibly decrease support for Ukraine, but it's not clear to me how he can increase support for Ukraine realistically. Which means that as far as that consideration goes, he has a considerable degree of leverage over Zelensky, but it's not clear he has, in that respect, leverage over Putin. He has leverage in other respects. The second detail that's being discussed is a demilitarized zone. And there are two problems with it at the moment. The first is we need serious European, non-NATO, non-US volunteers to do this. And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that yet. But secondly, even if we were to see that, why would Putin agree to that? If I were Putin's evil advisor and he called me and he said, look, 4 European countries have come forward to do this demilitarized zone, should I agree to it? I would say, unless some new facts are introduced into the equation that we're not seeing today, don't agree with it. You have many vulnerabilities. There are ways in which what you're doing is not sustainable militarily and economically. But even if you're losing the war, Ukraine is losing it more rapidly, as Mark Galeotti says. So keep pressing on your advantage. You don't need to agree to this demilitarized zone with these 4 European volunteer countries. Why would you? Something else needs to be put on the table that compels you in that direction. And at the moment, the cumulative advantage, despite you having a disaster in many ways, is still with you on balance, because it's always a matter of a comparative judgment of not how badly Russia is doing, but where Russia is politically, economically, and militarily relative to Ukraine. Lots of love and talk very soon.